So we left off with, we just covered a flat wash, and now we're going to move on to glazing. Glazing is when you add another layer of watercolor over an existing wash. So this creates a layered effect that can help with creating deeper layer of colors. It will change the overall appearance of the watercolor. When you're glazing, you can also, it's just the act of layering. So you can use this to add finer details. You can use this to add shadows over a color. It changes the appearance of the watercolor. So that's what the image is showing you on the right. It shows you what different colors look layered on top of other colors. So like it looks different layering blue over red than it does layering blue over yellow. It's a good idea to test out glazes on a practice sheet before applying them to a composition just because you're not going to be 100% sure what it looks like when it's done. When glazing, don't use a heavy coat of watercolor, use a slightly opaque wash. So don't use full-on pigment, water down that paint a little bit more. With watercolor, it's really good to apply more layers on top of a painting. That will help create a more of appearance of depth, so more shading, more value on there than it would be just to have stark difference between two colors. Next is blotting. So blotting is when you use an absorbent material. We're typically going to be using paper towels to remove watercolor paint from the page while it's still wet. So if you act very fast, if you make a mistake, like if you accidentally spill your water cup on your paper, you can blot all of that up, let your paper dry, and it should be good. You can also use it to apply texture. So you can put a light wash over another wash, do some glazing like we just mentioned, blot it a little bit, and it'll create a textural appearance. And you can test this out on a piece of paper too, just to see what it looks like. It kind of gives the effect of like trees or water. It has a really cool texture. So troubleshooting, you're always going to have issues when when interacting with paint. These are a few ways to troubleshoot that. So one main tip that I have is wait for one layer to dry before adding another. If you add watercolor on top of wet watercolor, it will bleed, which means the two colors will mix together and then it might turn an ugly brown. Use large brushes for large areas and small brushes for tiny details. It would be very hard to fill a large space with a tiny brush, and it would be very hard to do tiny details with a large brush. When you're outlining something, use a confident and steady hand. So you just need to be very sure about what you're doing, and that comes with practice and time. Outlining a large area, use the side of a flat paintbrush, or you can also use a detailed brush or a round brush. If your paint is streaky, add more water. If your paint is too translucent, add more paint. Practice texture on paper before adding it to your final composition. So you always want to practice something before completing it, just so you know what it's going to look like and you know what you're doing. Create texture by layering a wash on top of another one by using a smaller paintbrush. A few of you that are going to be moving a little bit faster on this can practice. I have some videos later in this PowerPoint about doing texture like fur texture. It helps if you paint left to right, if you're right-handed, or right to left if you're left-handed, because you don't want to be putting your arm or your hand in wet paint. When you're working with watercolor, it's easier to start big and work your way small. So start with a large wash and fill a large area, and then add the tinier details. Watercolor looks darker when it's wet, and then it might turn streaky if it's dried. If it's streaky, add another wash. Layering is going to be your best friend. So the brush also moves better when going from left to right than right to left. And this is opposite for lefties. It just helps if your brush can glide instead of like staggering on itself. Be aware of gravity. If you hold up your paper, it might drip. And you can always go darker, but it's nearly impossible to go lighter.